Good evening and welcome to the second session in the This Lead is Killing Us web series hosted by the Martin & Gale Press Health Professions Division Library at Nova Southeastern University. A few housekeeping things before we begin. First, the session is being recorded and will be posted on our website, which I will share in just a moment. During the presentation, please make sure to remain muted, and there will be time at the end for questions. Feel free to enter your questions into the chat box as you think of them, and we'll get to as many as possible during the Q&A session. This web series is based on the National Library of Medicine digital exhibit, This Lead is Killing Us, a history of citizens fighting lead poisoning in their communities, guest curated by Dr. Richard Mizell from University of Houston. The exhibit explores how citizens have confronted lead industries, housing authorities, and elected officials to protect their health against the dangers of lead poisoning. The goal of this companion web series is to raise awareness about lead poisoning and empower our communities to advocate for healthier places to live, learn, and work. We have created a website with a link to the free online exhibit, which includes images, photographs, and documents for you to explore. The website also has the list of virtual events and resources, and you can access it by going to lib.nova.edu/lead. In virtual events, you will find information for all the events in our web series, such as date, time, description, and link to register or join. We'll be adding 2 more events, so please check the page often for any updates. And on this page, you will find links to the recordings once they have been posted. In the resources page, you will find information on lead, lead poisoning, environmental health topics, and environmental justice. This evening, we're fortunate to have 2 presenters, Dr. Robert Speth and Dr. A. Bernadette Mayfield-Clarke. I will first introduce Dr. Speth, and then he will present, and then I will introduce Dr. Mayfield-Clarke before her presentation begins. So we're excited to welcome Dr. Robert Speth, who obtained a bachelor's degree from Western Maryland College, majoring in biology and psychology, his master's degree in physiological psychology at Connecticut College, and his PhD at Vanderbilt University studying pharmacology and neuroscience. He then went on to do a postdoctoral research as an NIH National Research Service awardee at the University of Arizona. Dr. Speth has conducted research focused largely on the brain, the renin-angiotensin system and receptors for neurotransmitters, hormones, drugs, and toxins at the Cleveland Clinic, Washington State University College of Veterinary Medicine, at which time he became a founding officer of the Society of Veterinary Medical Ethics, past president and founding editor of its newsletter, at Oregon Health Sciences University and the University of Mississippi, where he chaired the pharmacology department of the School of Pharmacy. While at Ole Miss, he increased the department's extramural funding from about $200,000 per year to nearly $4 million per year. He is presently professor of pharmaceutical sciences in the College of Pharmacy, an adjunct professor of biology and the Honors College at Nova Southeastern University. He's also adjunct professor of pharmacology and physiology in the School of Medicine at Georgetown, and a research associate of the Institute for Ethnomedicine in Jackson, Wyoming. Dr. Speth has also prepared radioligands for researchers since 1982, most recently at Georgetown. He has received numerous awards for his advocacy of biomedical research with animal models, his support of academic libraries, and scholarly activities. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a fellow of the American Heart Association. He received the Provost Award for Research and Scholarship from NSU in 2016 and the World Class Faculty Award from the Greater Fort Lauderdale Alliance in 2017. He has published over 200 peer-reviewed scientific manuscripts and over 500 total publications. He has special interests in the pharmacological and toxicological properties of natural products, especially marijuana, in particular their use and abuse as drugs, as well as dietary supplements and medical adjuvants, and the philosophy of neuroscience, as evidenced by his 2014 TEDx NSU talk, So There's No Free Will, Now What? And the Nician philosophy of toxicology. He's also interested in combining art and science, as evidenced by his talk, Which Drug Did Roger Chillingworth Use on the Reverend Dimsdale in the Scarlet Letter? And his use of poetry to teach pharmacology and bioethics, which he has been teaching for 28 years. Most recently, Dr. Speth has become involved in efforts to combat systemic racism and the mounting anti-science movements in our society. Dr. Speth has also found the time to be the general manager and CFO of the Kosciuszko and Southwestern Railway while residing in Mississippi. His greatest aspiration is to mentor students in the manner that he was mentored by his postdoctoral mentor, Henry Hank Yamamura, to whom Dr. Speth credits much of his success in academia. So we're very honored to have Dr. Speth with us today, and I will pass it over to him.
Okay, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Let me see if I can share the screen here and get my presentation up here. Hopefully that's the right one. No, it's not. Let me try again. Okay, can you see my presentation?
No, just your browser.
Okay.
Yeah, if you click on your, actually, I think if you just click on the PowerPoint icon at the bottom.
Yeah. Did that work?
No.
No. Okay. No, I think I'm gonna have to unshare.
Okay.
And okay, stop share. Share screen. Let me do screen 2. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay, so let me go into slideshow. Okay. Can you see my
we can see the presenter notes. If you want,
yeah,
you can go up. Yeah, you can go to display settings. Yep. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, now you got it?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So in the fashion of the Rocky and Bullwinkle show, I have 2 titles: Get the Lead Out or Smelter, Skelter. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present here, and thank you, Daisy, for inviting me to present here. So usually I start out with a disclosure. I do want to mention that I don't have any disclosures. I have no conflicts of interest, no financial interest whatsoever. So I believe that the information I'm presenting is going to be totally objective. So what I want to do is start out here with something that I did have a personal interest in because I used to go skiing in Kellogg, Idaho at Silver Mountain. And Kellogg, Idaho and the area around it was the site of one of the major Superfund sites associated with the lead contamination associated with the Bunker Hill Mining Company, Smelter, which was in Smelterville, Idaho, which was in right next door to Kellogg, Idaho. So finally, in 1996, they totally dismantled the smokestacks of the Bunker Hill smelter. And this is showing the smokestacks being blown up and falling over. So I found this wonderful book called Leaded by Michael Mix, which talks about the poisoning of Idaho's Silver Valley. And I do want to call your attention to these dotted lines that I added on to this graphic picture on the front of the book, which was approximately 3,000 feet in elevation. And you can notice that below 3,000 feet, it's all brown and there's no growth. But above 3,000 feet, you see the green forestry. This is a result of the environmental contamination associated with the smelter that was built in 1917 and operated until 1981. So this is the environmental damage. The human damage was far worse. So interestingly, even before it opened in 1917, it was known that lead contamination would cause health problems. But they kind of ignored them. And even though many of the workers became ill after the operations began, they said, oh, well, the workers are not using proper hygiene. So the blame for them being contaminated by lead was put on the workers, when in fact there was nothing they could do. And the insensitivity of the Bunker Hill Mining Company towards the workers' health is a travesty. Public health officials were concerned, but again, they didn't have very much power at that time to do anything. So they were starting to see epidemics of lead poisoning, negative reproductive effects, sterility, spontaneous abortion, stillbirth, premature delivery for wives of lead workers, and very high rates of infant mortality. And then we fast forward to the 1950s and 1960s, an increasing in awareness after World War II of the importance of environmental toxicity. And there were laws passed in the 50s and 60s to try and abate water and air pollution. Unfortunately, they didn't go very far because in Idaho, there really wasn't much power to stand up to the power of the industrial interests. So, and they went around and said, oh, well, here's our research that shows that our industry is not having any serious health effects and had a disproportionate influence on shaping federal policies concerning lead toxicity. So this is just something I took from the book. The Bunker Hill industrial area was finally listed as the largest Superfund site in the United States in 1983, encompassing 21 square miles, including Kellogg and several surrounding towns. It was later expanded to include the entire Coeur d'Alene River Basin. The cost was estimated in 1983 to be $1 billion, and they anticipated taking decades to complete. But the worst situation was in 1973, a bag house fire destroyed the bags that were used to filter particulates before they were released in the smelter stacks for emissions. And rather than stop production until the bags could be replaced, they continued operations with no attempt to mitigate the emissions. And as a result, the lead level in the air in downtown Kellogg went from 7 micrograms per mil, which is already ridiculously high, to 17 micrograms per mil in 1973. Local veterinarians were inundated with cases of livestock deaths that were a direct result of the toxic levels of lead in the area. And in 1974, they did surveys of area children's blood levels of lead. And greater than 80 deciliters, 80 micrograms per deciliter is classified as lead poisoning. And it was found in 21% of the children surveyed who lived within a mile of the smelter. So this is someone who was a heroine in the occupational medicine. She, Alice Hamilton, back in 1914, I believe, went around and did investigations of factories that were causing pollution. And what she did was she went to the workers' homes so that they didn't have to worry about someone overhearing their talking when they were at work. And she found out what they really felt because they could feel they had the courage to speak what was on their minds. She made many discoveries that she wouldn't have found by just talking to the industrial representatives. And she became the inspiration that would eventually lead many others to become concerned and advocates for worker safety and health reforms and to become activists. Also in 1914, a very well distributed book on lead poisoning was authored by Sir Thomas Oliver. And he basically said, when indiscriminately employed, lead and its compounds are a source of much suffering. And we'll talk about that more and more. So one of the major concerns is childhood lead poisoning. The Centers for Disease Control has made this one of their major concerns. And up until 1978, lead-based paints were still used in houses, but it was banned in 1978. However, we still see a lot of lead-based paint still around, and a lot of it is chipping and peeling. And this is very enticing to children to peel it off and then put it in their mouths. And as a result, they get lead poisoning. So there's still 24 million housing units with lead-based paint hazards, of which 4 million are homes to young children. So this is just a very quick visual on what can happen to children when they're lead poisoned. They have damaged their brain and nervous system, slowed growth and development, learning and behavior problems, hearing and speech problems, resulting in lower IQ, inability to pay attention, and poor performance in school. So these are some facts from the World Health Organization. Lead is a cumulative toxicant that affects multiple body systems, and again, is particularly harmful to children. It distributes in the brain, the liver, kidney, and very much so in the bones. It's also stored in the teeth, where it accumulates over time. But it's slowly released, so it makes a continuing source of toxicity. It can cross the placental barrier and therefore affect the developing fetus. And very importantly, there is no level of exposure to lead that is known to be without harmful effects. However, lead exposure is preventable. There are therapies. But again, quoting the World Health Organization, in 2019, lead exposure was attributed to causing 900,000 deaths and 21.7 million years of healthy life lost because of disabilities associated with lead toxicity. In 2019, lead exposure caused to 62% of the global burden of intellectual disability, 8% of the global burden of hypertensive heart disease, 7% of the global burden of ischemic heart disease, and nearly 6% of the global burden of stroke. So these are just a list of health effects from short-term overexposure to lead from the CDC. So these are some of the signs: abdominal pain, constipation, tiredness, achy, headachy, irritability, loss of appetite, and most importantly, memory loss, pain or tingling in the hands or feet, neuropathy, and a weakness. And it's very insidious because these symptoms may occur slowly and you don't realize that it's a lead poisoning that's causing all these progressive debilitation. So, and as noted before, very high lead exposure can cause death. So this is a periodic table. This is where we find lead, symbol is PB. This is very ancient. We've known about lead for thousands of years. This is a symbol in ancient Roman characters for lead. One take-home message here is the density, 11.3 grams per cubic centimeter. Water is 1 gram per cubic centimeter, and you know how heavy a bucket of water is. So lead is incredibly dense and heavy material. So what are the commercial uses of lead? Well, we banned household use in 1978, but we still see some use in ceramics. Leaded gasoline was mostly phased out in 1996. However, we still use lead acid car batteries, and this is the principal consumption of lead currently. And this is why you have to pay a fee to have your battery recycled, because they have to properly dispose of the lead in your car battery when it dies. And then we have the lead pipes issue, which we'll talk about increasingly, because this has been a source of water contamination in many places, particularly the Flint, Michigan situation. So we still see lead being used as pigments in some paints, commercial paints, and again for pottery, to making glaze, colored glaze in pottery. Ammunition, you've heard somebody getting plugged with lead. Actually, lead shot from shotguns from duck hunters is a major source of lead contamination in the environment. Lead alloys are used in many cases, and also lead sheeting. And I'll show you an example of some use of lead shielding that I am currently using. And then we have lead weights for scuba diving. So this is in my lab. This is some lead sheet that I have that I use to shield my radioactive waste. This is what's called a lead pig. This is a container that I ship radioactivity in, and it blocks all the gamma rays emanating from the iodine 125 that I use in my research. So this is EPA stopping leaded gasoline, which had been blended with gasoline to boost octane levels since the early 1920s. So this was one of the great environmental achievements of all time. decreasing blood levels in children by 70%. Okay, so this is a major step forward when we got rid of the lead in gasoline. Unfortunately, there is still some fuel that contains lead, racing cars, aircraft, farm equipment, and off-road vehicles. And in actuality, piston-based aircraft, these are the propeller planes that fly around, are still running on leaded gas and are the largest contributors of airborne lead in the country. However, every single country now in the world has stopped making leaded fuel for vehicles. And Algeria was the last country to stop it, and that was just last month or a couple months ago. So again, I mentioned that lead can cross the placental barrier. That means that pregnant women who are exposed to lead are also exposing their unborn children. There's, again, the many adverse effects of lead exposure: miscarriage, stillbirths, and infertility. Lead does affect children more than adults and at much lower levels. So the neurological defects and intellectual disability have actually occurred in children whose parents were working in the lead industry and came home with lead dust on their clothes, and that intoxicated their children. So this is prolonged exposure to lead, very similar signs and symptoms. And again, risk for high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney disease, and reduced fertility. And in addition, the EPA has now come out and said that lead is probably a cancer-causing agent in humans. So just a little pharmacology here, mechanisms of lead toxicity. How am I doing on time? I hope I'm not going over. I think I'm close. But many of the neurotoxic effects appear to be due to the fact that lead can mimic or substitute for calcium in cells, and particularly neurons. And this interferes with synaptic transmission. So what happens is the neurons become leaky, and they start leaking out neurotransmitter when you don't want it to go out. But then when you want it to go out with a nerve stimulation, a nerve impulse, the evoked release is inhibited. So this interferes with normal synaptic transmission in the brain, which can interfere with the development of synapses, which are the specialized regions of the brain where two neurons will come in close contact so that one neuron can release a neurotransmitter to communicate to the other neuron. So ultimately, there's less efficient brain with cognitive deficits. You also see some breakdown in the blood-brain barrier because the lead has toxic effects on endothelial cells, which are very important for normal cardiovascular function, and in particular, the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. It also damages astrocytes. These are glial cells that also participate in blood-brain barrier integrity. So one of the problems is that lead is ubiquitous in our environment. We have spread lead all over the place. So it's hard to get away from the fact that anything you touch is likely to have some degree of lead contamination. So in terms of the heart, cardiovascular, and hypertension, chronic lead exposure will promote oxidative stress. It alters the renin-angiotensin system. It puts it up a notch, which is something that I'm very interested. This is my major area of research. It promotes inflammation, disturbs the ability of vascular smooth muscle to respond to calcium, and interferes with endothelium-dependent vasorelaxation. Hence, we have hypertension. So lead has also been shown to, hold on, okay. Lead has also been shown to cause endothelial injury and block endothelial repair and inhibit angiogenesis. Angiogenesis is the growth of new blood vessels when you have ischemia. Normally, the blood vessels will try to grow new blood vessels to supply the blood and the nutrients of the bloodstream to the area that doesn't have adequate blood supply. And then finally, lead exposure does promote atherosclerosis and thrombosis. So it's a major contributor to stroke, as I mentioned before. So I'm not going to talk too much about the Flint water crisis. I think Dr. Mayfield-Clarke is going to be talking about that in more detail. But certainly this was a very tragic situation where the city did not take the proper precautions to make sure that there wasn't lead leaching from the water. This is Dr. Mona Hannah Atisha. She is the pediatrician who first exposed the Flint lead intoxication because she found elevated levels of lead in the local children that she was seeing. She's written a book about it. I've also heard her give a presentation that I farmed out. And basically she considers Flint a crime scene and says that the city is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder from this water disaster. So I want to tell you this story about a real life Hollywood tragedy. Allison Hayes was an actress in the 1950s and 1960s. She developed dysmenorrhea and her OBGYN prescribed a calcium supplement. And a couple of years later, she developed muscle weakness. And so the OBGYN said, well, double the dose. So by 1967, she had lost the ability to walk. She was losing her hair. And in 1968, she was confined to a wheelchair and stopped taking the supplement finally. But in the meantime, she had been to 22 doctors trying to diagnose her problem, and none of them could do that. So in 1970, she gave up and started doing her own research. And she discovered, while looking in the library on toxicology textbooks, that her symptoms were very similar to heavy metal poisoning. So she sent samples of her hair and supplement to a forensic toxicologist who found high concentrations of lead in her hair and in the supplement. Unfortunately, in 1976, she was diagnosed with leukemia, possibly attributed to the 340 x-rays that were carried out by the 22 physicians who were unable to diagnose her condition. And unfortunately, in 1977, she died shortly after receiving a $50,000 supplement from a settlement from the supplement manufacturer. And she had also talked to the FDA and they said, well, sorry, but this isn't in our purview. So what happened? Well, that supplement was made from the bones of old carriage horses from England, from London, that had inhaled leaded gasoline over their entire lifetime. So as a result, their bones were heavily contaminated with lead. So much for at least it won't do any harm with respect to dietary supplements. And I got this from Marvin Davis's book in 2006. And then a cruel irony, a letter that was sent to her after her death, the FDA said, we're putting in some amendments to make sure that the importation of nutritional supplements is better regulated to stop this from happening. So finally, why is our public health facing a crisis across the US? Well, I have to say I've got a personal interest in this. Danielle Ivory was my next door neighbor when I lived in oops, that was a mistake on my part. My bad, let me go back, see if I can advance here. Anyway, Danielle was our next door neighbor, and my daughter actually used to babysit for her. No, went too far. I actually published a paper with her mom that was one of my most heavily cited papers ever. So anyway, they did a survey of 220 health departments and found that all of these health departments are finding their ability to do their work compromised because of the increased challenges of dealing with the pandemic. And basically, there's an increase in drug overdoses now because of the inability of public health agencies to deal with this, decreased reports on child abuse. And they also noted in this article that Oswego County reported a surge in lead poisoning. So one of the problems here is that, okay, let me go to, one of the problems is that the people they are trying to help are the people who are threatening them, and to the point of threatening their lives. So it's a cruel irony that the people that they are trying to save are making threats to them to kill them because they're trying to save their lives. So it's a horrendous situation that we find ourselves in. So basically, despite the huge number of deaths, we now find our public health agencies less capable now to confront a pandemic if another one comes along than it was in 2020. And we were woefully unprepared for the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. And obviously, our ability to respond to public health crises such as lead intoxication from contaminated sources is also going to be severely handicapped. So finally, I discovered that I wasn't the first one to think of Smelter Skelter. So if you want a commemorative of my presentation, you can buy this little Smelter Skelter toy for only $100. So thank you for your attention. And I'm sorry I may have gone a little bit over. My apologies to Dr. Mayfield-Clarke, and I will get out of the way. And let me see if I can stop sharing here very quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Speth. All right. Let me share my screen here so we can move along and have time for questions. Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and welcome Dr. Bernadette Mayfield-Clarke, who's had a fulfilling and versatile career as an administrator employed in various settings, including school-based, contract services, clinical, healthcare service provider, university professor, program director, and associate dean for research and graduate studies. She received her PhD and master's degrees in human communication sciences and disorders from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and a bachelor's degree in communication sciences and disorders from Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Dr. Mayfield-Clarke currently functions as a private practitioner consultant with a specialization in corporate speech-language pathology for government employees and English language learner speakers. In addition, she serves as a peer reviewer for the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services as a member of a standing panel for Individual with Disabilities Education Act. With her in-depth knowledge of programmatic and university operations, Dr. Mayfield-Clarke has worked as a program professor for the Master of Science and Doctor of Speech-Language Pathology at Nova Southeastern University College of Healthcare Sciences in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She acted as an associate dean for research and graduate studies in the College of Arts and Sciences and tenured associate professor and program director for speech communication and speech-language pathology and audiology at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. Prior to relocating to North Carolina, Dr. Mayfield-Clarke was an adjunct clinical faculty at California State University Northridge and director of SLP for 200-bed skilled nursing facility and a contractor for school-based services and rehabilitation hospitals. Her volunteer services to ASHA include chair, financial planning board, appointed member of the FPB, STEP mentor, and member of SIG 11 administration and supervision. She has also served on the board of directors of the National Black Association for Speech Language Hearing Association and convention chairperson. She was an advisory board member of the North Carolina State Employees Credit Union, Stony Brook branch, and she's an ASHA fellow and the vice president for finance for board of directors of American Speech Language Hearing Association. So without further ado, Dr. Mayfield-Clarke.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Speth. The one thing we do have in common, we found out last night, we have so much in common, but is the historical perspective. And I'm so glad that he covered a lot of that. So if you hear it or see it again, it is because retrospectively speaking, I'm going from where we were to where we are now. And hopefully in 20 minutes, we can do that. But we're going to look at how this lead poisoning has changed, if at all, if at any. Ms. De La Rosa, you can change to the next slide, please. That just simply talks about how we're going to look at past research and how it's impacted our environmental health, developmental stances of children. And I'm looking at these babies from 0 to 6 and then quantify the current regime to ask ourselves, how has it changed in 2021 in terms of lead poisoning? Next slide. Historically speaking, lead has been with us since antiquity. There was a Greek poet or philosopher named, physician named Nicander, who has talked about lead poisoning 2,000 years ago. So we go from 2,000 years ago to the 20s, where Rudolph looked at children who lived in a lead environment. Most of what Dr. Speth showed you, this lead world was covered by children having this appetite for pica. And pica is where children, particularly babies, anywhere between 12 to 18 months, have the hand to the mouth to the brain. So what goes on the hands goes in the mouth. And so this is how the lead poisoning then became an issue. We saw it first observed in Australia in the 1890s, in the United States in the 20s and the 30s. We now are looking at studies increasing because children have ingested more lead paint, particularly those that have been discarded by the auto batteries that Dr. Speth showed you. The casting, they would burn these batteries in the fuel during the winter. So now you have the ash that's being carried through the air. In the 30s and the 40s, instances of childhood lead poisoning now are looking at cases of brain tumors and acute abdominal conditions. This particular disease, the lead poisoning, was dubbed as the depression disease. Next slide. What you have here is the 70s. We now are getting into the congressional hearings where there's now an act, the Lead-Based Paint Poisoning Prevention Act, which occurred early in the 70s, Public Law 91-695, and then it was amended twice over right up to 1976. This provided funding for the mass screening and the prevention programs that I was able to utilize during my collection of data. We go from there to lead poisoning now evolving into a clinical syndrome, which was associated with blood lead levels of 60 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood. As you notice, in 1973, the definition for lead-based paint had been changed, supposedly lowered. Then you have Lin Fu, who was writing, doing a lot of research looking at minimal brain dysfunction. This led to autopsy study by Chisholm and others, and Chisholm was in Baltimore doing research, and he was looking at cerebral edema and then the effect on the neurons, particularly the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the basal ganglia. We then have further studies with Bellinger and others, and if you look at the lead poisoning research, you will see these researchers quite adamantly, Needleman and others, and then the Agency of Toxic Substance Disease Registry in 1990. Next screen. This particular slide shows you the history of how lead poisoning criteria has been lowered to be considered as the safe level, or what we call acceptable level, and we're going to talk about that. So here we are in 2021, and it is 5 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood. That's considered the safe or the acceptable level. We need to ask ourselves, is that in fact the case? Next slide. Dr. Bunny, he's the chief at the hospital in Wayne County. I guess Wayne County is Detroit. He's over the lead poisoning prevention center there, and he had some research that talked about there is no normal lead level. Let's be real clear about that. That lead is not an element that should be in our bodies because it has no physiological function. As a result, what we've done is, quote, use it as CDC has used it as acceptable, when in fact it was substituted for normal, particularly when you have this assimilation from food, from water and air, which I'll show you in a little bit. The acceptable level continues to show that children are still being impacted by this, and it is not. Children are still having problems, developmental delays and physical ailments, all kinds of ailments, and we'll see with the water leaching from the pipes in Flint, Michigan. But there is no correct value for blood lead level other than 0. Next slide. Lead in children, now we're up to at least 4 million households, and we know it could be possibly higher. And of those 4 million children, 500,000 of them are between the ages of 1 to 5. And these children have lead exposure that has impacted every system in their bodies, which I will show you shortly. And what's interesting about lead exposure, it goes unrecognized and there's no obvious symptoms that parents can really put their fingers on. Next slide. This is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This is NHANES. When I collected the research data, that was 1998. That was the NHANES 2. This is results from NHANES 3. You now have children ages 1 to 5, African-American in terms of race and ethnicity, living in low-income housing, and living in pre-1946 housing that is associated with elevated blood levels. The lead poisoning rates are higher among African-American children than Mexican-American children, and children that are non-Hispanic and white by 2.3%. Next slide, please. This is a model I used to describe how lead is metabolized in the body. What I want you to know is that lead is age dependent. It is that less than 10% of all the lead that is stored in the body is deposited into the soft tissue. And that's your muscles, your liver, your kidneys. And then the other 90% is in the skeleton. What's interesting about you being able to excrete it is that 90% of that lead leaves the body via urine, and then the other remainder is excreted through the feces. There's only a very small amount that is lost in the sweat and the hair and the nails. Next slide, please. When you talk about the metabolism of lead, lead is affected by the age, the dose, and the duration. How long has it been in the body? How much of the lead is in the body? And then the age of the child at the time of examination. In adults, however, they absorb anywhere between 5 to 10% of dietary lead, whereas young children obtain or absorb as much as 40 to 50%. But for them, they're retaining 20 to 25% in their system. That spontaneous accretion usually is less than 50 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood in a 24-hour period. But by that time, you have now seen a child who has had acute poisoning. And this lead poisoning, the absorption rate can be increased in diets that are high in fat or low in calcium, magnesium, iron, zinc, and copper. And the major two components are, again, the bone, where half-life, that lead remains in those bones up to 20 years. And in the soft tissue, half-life becomes 20 to 30 days when you think about little people. So that toxicity is related to concentration in small mobile soft tissue. Next slide, please. This is the legacy that we're leaving our children, which is really pretty sad, how lead affects children's health. In the brain, anytime there's exposure, you have the possibility of low IQ points, ADHD, hearing loss, damaged nerves, loss of body movement, stupor, hyper-irritability, coma, and even death. As Dr. Speth said about the heart, now long-term exposure in adults is showing up after the age of 50 and in terms of hypertension and cardiovascular disease. In children, the lead also disrupts that level of vitamin D that they should be getting. It will impair the cell growth, maturation, cause problems with their tooth and bone development. If it gets in the blood, it inhibits the ability to make hemoglobin, which then causes anemia. And this is one of those signs and symptoms that you will see in the child will be that iron deficiency anemia. That causes lightheadedness, fatigue, rapid heartbeat, dizziness, and shortness of breath. In the stomach, you hear complaints of abdominal cramping and pain. In the kidneys, you have chronic inflammation, kidney failure, blood in the urine, fever, nausea, weight gain, confusion, rash, and urinary changes. And those were some of the complaints from the parents in Flint, Michigan. In the stomach, we did already. The reproductive system, if moderate exposure in men can cause a low sperm count, but also can damage the sperm, and it can decrease the motility of the sperm, which then speaks to reproduction cycle. And when lead is impacted in terms of getting in the bones, then you have problems with slow growth and development in children. Next slide. When you look at the diagnosis of what we call subclinical lead poisoning, most of these children appear to their pediatrician asymptomatic. The symptoms are pretty subtle and non-specific. Their physical exam usually comes out normal, not unless there's some incident or a child with complaints of acute encephalopathy. Lead poisoning should be considered when there's a differential diagnosis of iron deficiency anemia, seizures, mental retardation, severe behavioral disorder, ADD, ADHD, colicky, abdominal pain, cerebral and abdominal crisis, such as you would see in a child with sickle cell. Next slide, please. The sources of lead I really wanted you to take a look at, because Dr. Speth looked at a lot of these and touched on majority of them. But when you see lead in your canned food, that tap water that we drink, we need to let that water run first thing in the morning before we choose to brush our teeth with it. Airborne lead, if you're living in an industrial region, thanks for those pictures because they were spot on, talking about the dirt and the soil. Those of you that engage in moonshine whiskey, be careful. Some pottery. Traditional folk remedies, these are culturally based and it depends on where you're from and what the parent or the grandparents are recommending. Makeup and powder. I'm going to die lead poisoning. Some imported candies, particularly from Mexico and the Philippines. Jewelry, some children's toys that were made in China because China's rate of lead in their paint is a little bit different. It's not as regulated as in the United States. And now, as of 2021, September and October, there's some name brand baby food that is showing up with lead poisoning. We have paint in homes around 1978, but as you saw from Dr. Speth, they're Speth. They're coming later. So you have this lead and lead plumbing in these homes. If your house is built between 1940s to the 1980s, there's a possibility that you need to check your pipes because of lead dust, emission from industrial sources, burning old batteries that we talked about, ceramic ware, colored newsprint in your papers, home remodeling and refinishing. I just got this study from the EPA as of 2021, St. Joseph, Missouri. I have a PhD student that's out there and she's seeing these children in a 1 mile radius who all are showing up with these remediations, having to seek additional services, allied health, you name it, all because of the zip code. The particular jobs that was mentioned earlier, construction, steel, welding, bridge, reconstruction, recycling, auto repair, and then hobbies. If you're target shooting, lead soldering, any of those, glaze making, stained glass, glaze pottery making, all of that contains lead. Next slide, please. This particular slide this is our most recent data that Dr. Speth was talking about. Water is a lead source. And Dr. Hannah Atisa, she's the pediatrician there. And she was the one that talked about and brought it to the news about lead in the water, which is severely toxic. And it presents damage to the central nervous system. And as a result, you have these, what she calls canaries in a coal mine. That's what she calls the babies. And from her study, she has identified 2.1% to 4.4% children who are showing signs of lead poisoning. By 5 years of age, these children are requiring special education and remediation. That's inclusive of speech and language services. By 10 years old, these children are diagnosed with ADHD. By 15 years of age, these children are now entering the criminal justice system because this is what is happening in lead. And if you notice, these times or the dates are showing you right up until last week. CBS talked about Benton Harbor in addition to the Flint, Michigan water crisis. And then Dr. Landrigan, who's also part of my research, is a physician at Mount Sinai in New York, indicates that lead causes irreversible damage, permanent injury to the brain, and no level of lead is safe, that the lead exposure puts these children at risk for lower IQ scores and developmental delays. Next slide, please. This is where I compared the blood lead levels at the time I collected data and the time that Dr. Bunny also collected data. Looking at now where the level is acceptable, you see a question mark there because it was less than 5 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood. I used my low level at that time had a mean blood level of 1 to 8 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood. My moderate group had 9 to 16, which now would be higher than 10. They would then need environmental evaluation, nutritional counseling, follow-up until the case is resolved. And anything higher than 40 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood would now need what we call chelation therapy. Next slide, please. This is the epidemiology as of 2012, but nothing has changed here. Dr. Harvey Kaufman, who runs Quest Diagnostics, did some research also and found that 1.1 million children in poor areas were tested. Of that, 50% of them tested positive for lead poisoning. That's 600,000 children. The Dr. John Lapoot, who was on CBS Morning News, said the reason that these children are showing up again in such high numbers is because CDC felt once the numbers started to go down prior to 1997, that they thought the children were getting better. But guess what? They're not. And as a result, now we have these numbers. Next slide. This is the epidemiology of the data from the 1950s to the 80s. If you notice, I put bright red so that you could see low-income housing prior to 1940. A lot of the symptoms would show up in the children generally during the summer, and drinking water reports. Children under the age of 6 displayed levels of concentration greater than 15 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood, between 15 to 30 micrograms from the lead pipes. So we know that constitutes Flint, Michigan, and now Benton Harbor. Again, pica played an important role in the children getting this into their systems, and that these children, the main victims were 1 to 6 years of age. 1 to 3 years of age was 85% of the cases, and the highest incident usually occurs at around 2. And that again is associated with this risk of pica. And these children with high lead levels are 6 times more likely to have reading disabilities. Next slide, please. Neurobehavioral effects. If you know, these are the levels as low as 5 micrograms per deciliter, and this was correlated with dentine lead. This is the lead they found in the children's teeth that was greater than 20 ppms. Again, the same kinds of factors that we're looking at, the impairment of academic success, lower class standing, greater absenteeism, difficulty in auditory comprehension, short-term memory and attention, the impairment of reading, deficits in vocabulary that I found, along with Needleman and others, fine motor skills, reaction time, eye-hand coordination. Next slide. This kind of sums up what we've already said in terms of there is no safe level of lead in these children that have been identified. I put impaired speech and language problems because I wanted to touch on that quickly. The good news is that childhood lead poisoning is 100% preventable. Next slide, please. This is the conceptual model that I use so that it could explain, if you're looking at the child lead levels, as I gave you the information a few minutes ago, the demographics, the race and ethnicity, child genetics, child early health history, and their prior behavior. Then if you look at their environmental lead exposure, I looked at all factors except the drug use. Didn't find that to be necessary. Next slide. This is the research, findings from my research. I wanted the children to be diagnosed with lead poisoning in low levels. And I wanted to make sure that they had no history of a metabolic disturbance. And this was based on an average of 4 multiple blood tests. Of the subjects, I got 982 in the city of Philadelphia. Of the 932, I only needed 30, and then I randomly assigned 10 into the respective groups that I needed them in terms of their lead levels. If you can look closely, group 1 had 77 subjects, group 2 had 417, group 3 had 488. And I wanted to make sure that none of the subjects had chelation therapy. And we recruited them from 3 areas in Philadelphia, all except for the east side of Philadelphia. They had to have normal level of hearing, and the director of the program identified and designated the lead groups for me using the census map from Philadelphia and by zip code and housing units. Surprisingly enough, it was only 2 project homes that I had to go into. The rest were just regular housing, row housing that they had. They were administered the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals. At that time, it was 3. We know it's 6 now. And the Fletcher time by count test. I did a pilot study in DC, which gave me similar findings. What I found was that these children had siblings, so you did not see as many expressive language problems as I thought I would. Next slide. These are the effects. The effects from children having those low levels of lead poisoning is that the total language score, lead had more consequences for their total language skills, and that it was moderately and negatively related to the total language score. This occurred with Yaman's study in 1977. So as the total language scores increased, the amount of lead in their bodies was decreased, or it was less than. In terms of the receptive language skills, there was a mutual relationship with the impact of lead exposure and the receptive language skills. That means that the receptive language, how well did the children acquire the information, listen to, hear, and be able to apply structures to their language, was much more affected than the expressive language score. So these children were at risk for having difficulties in their ability to apply appropriate structures to their sentences and learn vocabulary. But the biggest finding of all had to do with the language age equivalent, which we look for with children. At the lead exposure level there demonstrated a moderate association. As the blood levels increased, the language age equivalent decreased. So this decrease in their language age equivalent, which was equated or compared to their chronological age, 60% of the population had language age appropriate scores. 40% of my population had difficulties, some significant developmental language delays that range anywhere from 4 months to 4.5 years. And this variability that we would see predisposed them for future language learning disabilities by the 3rd grade and no later than the 5th grade. So these findings concurred with Needleman's study and Earhart and Green. And the blood lead levels delivered an outward impression that results in long-term consequences for the language age equivalent. So as that child develops over time, his language age equivalent will grow or become wider, and may be due to the subtle damages from the lead poisoning. Last slide, please. I just thought I'd throw this in. So if you have, or you know of anyone whose child has been exposed to lead, or you yourself, here's some of the things you can eat, drink: celery juice, grapes, wild blueberries, leafy green vegetables, radish, garlic, spirulina, chia seeds, bone broth, ginger, cilantro, apples. Next slide. I have some historical references for you, as well as current references from 2016 to 2021. And I want to thank you all again for your time and attention, for being here with us. And by all means, give Ms. Della Rosa a big round of applause, because she has put in a lot of great work to get this done. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Speth, for meeting you and your presentation.
My pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much to both of you. It's been really fascinating, a little scary. So we want to, I know we're at time, but if the presenters are okay with it, I mean, I'm okay with staying. And if anyone has any questions, um, I know it's a lot to cover. So feel free to unmute yourself. You don't have to use the chat. If you want to use the chat, that's okay too. So give a couple seconds here for everyone to gather their thoughts. If anyone has any questions.
Questions, comments, or concerns?
I have a question.
Ms. Jefferson,
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good.
That's great. Really interesting presentation. I had a question about the subjects that were part of the research. Are they being monitored in any way now? Because it's some years since the research was.
Good question. At that time, the lead prevention programs were in full force and doing an excellent job. And so we had this data, and they were able to monitor these children. You know, when you're trying to get your PhD and get out of school, the last thing you think about is what's going to happen afterwards. However, Needleman and some others have done longitudinal studies. These kids now should be in their 20s, maybe early 30s, but nobody that I know followed after the fact. But it's a good, thank you. It's a good question. And it was something I wanted to continue. But then when you get to reality and you get to jobs and you get to the university, the research focus becomes different and the mission and the values become different. So didn't follow them. Because only 40% of my subjects just required services. The other 60% did very well because of the lead program prevention services.
Okay, thank you. And I do understand once you're done with research, sometimes it's just not possible to continue.
So we do have a question here from Majid. What are some of the precautions we can take, especially the parents with young children, to make sure we keep the lead away in our homes?
You've got to look at the age of your home. Hopefully you have that information available. Make sure that the pipes are not lead-based. If they are, by all means, as I said, run that water first thing in the morning, boil your water, or just use bottled water. You know, I use bottled water now for cooking. My husband just hates the thought, but, and I do it because of the research. I do it to reduce as much as possible because the little people, you're constantly having to wash their hands. Well, you know, that's not always possible, particularly if they're playing on the ground and if they're playing outside. But just keeping as much dust away from them as possible. Hopefully you're not living in a lead belted community. You're not living in an industrial area. We've got to be really cognizant of the toys that we're buying, what paint is on the toys. I mean, didn't even think about that. Now it's in the baby's food, it's in the soil. So, you know, you've got to, we're really going to have to return to basics, growing your own vegetables, pureeing the food for the children, or just, you know, buying organic as best you can. This is really hard because we all have some level of lead poisoning in our systems, although as adults, we do better with excreting it. Children have a really hard time. So just monitoring their food intake, bottled water, the toys, and their environmental activities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, great question. And you know, Dr. Speth, you mentioned the supplements. Is that still something we have to be careful about as far as lead and any dietary supplements? Is that still a thing?
Yes, very much so. Unfortunately, and you know, the FDA is just terribly undermanned and is not able to do adequate safety testing of all the supplements that are coming in from foreign countries. And you know, there's a lot of unscrupulous manufacturers of dietary supplements who do not pay any attention to quality control or safety of their products. And they are relying on the fact that the FDA is not going to take any steps unless there are major complaints to the FDA or to the manufacturer, who is required to report any adverse effects to the FDA. And it's only after the damage is done that the FDA comes in and tries to stop the further damage. So yeah, and increasingly we're seeing dietary supplements having QR codes, such that you can check to see if they've been certified by an independent laboratory for purity and for the absence of any heavy metal contamination. So yeah, look for the QR code, look for reputable manufacturers for the dietary supplements that you're going to take. And that would greatly diminish the risk of having any heavy metal contamination. And it's not just lead, it's mercury
Cadmium,
and
mercury.
cadmium. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Any other questions? I did have one more about the chelation therapy and what that is. And I know that you mentioned that it's the effects are irreversible. So is the therapy like for an acute case of lead, what does the therapy do, or how does it help?
Well,
Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
gonna let that Dr. Speth handle that one. I know it depends on what the level is, and now anything over 5 micrograms per deciliter of whole blood. Now they're saying 40 would be the level where the child would get the chelation therapy. Doctors will talk to you about it, but I didn't want any children who had been exposed to that
Right.
process.
So yeah, chelation therapy is definitely one of the best ways to go. And the thing is, you want to do it repeatedly because as the lead leaches out of the bones, it's going to start to accumulate again. So I've seen papers where they do it like monthly. And the one paper I was looking at, and I would have liked to have included it in my presentation, but I was already over time, is a study using calcium EDTA. EDTA is an excellent metal chelator. And they were saying that the calcium EDTA is much easier on the body and easier to administer. You can administer it quicker than the more common sodium EDTA. But what they did is they just did monthly chelation therapy, and they were able to reduce the lead levels by about 40% over this. I think they did it over a 1 year period. So if you do have lead intoxication, then definitely look to chelation therapy and repeated chelation therapy, so at something like monthly intervals.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Any other questions before we wrap up? A lot of thank yous, wonderful information. Glad that you put the detox foods at the end of your presentation, Dr. Mayfield-Clarke. Just really great. Thank you very, very much. And yeah, exactly. Thank you for your research on this and all the work you put into this. Really, really grateful for that. So just to close this out here, see if I have, next week is National Lead Poisoning Prevention Week and International Lead Poisoning Prevention Week. So you can find more information on our resources page. Also, just a small plug for the NSU Alvin Sherman Library, who is one of our partners in promoting this web series and virtual exhibits. If you live or work in Broward County, you can apply for an Alvin Sherman Library card. It's free, and you'll have access to many resources and get notified about events like this one. And finally, thank you all for attending, for staying on with us. A special thank you to our guests and the committee who helped organize this event. And please visit lib.nova.edu/lead for more information and upcoming events. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you all too. Have a good evening and happy holidays.
Thank you.